blood and silence. The history of the Italian Mafia. The roots of Cosa Nostra. The story of the Italian Mafia does not begin with the glamour of American movies or the blood-soaked streets of New York. It begins far earlier, in a land both beautiful and cursed, Sicily. To understand the Mafia, one must first understand Sicily itself, its fractured history, its brutal poverty, and its deep distrust of authority. The Mafia was not simply born. It was cultivated in the soil of injustice, watered with blood, and sustained by silence. A land of conquest and poverty. Sicily is an island of contradictions. At its heart lies breathtaking beauty. Golden wheat fields, lemon groves perfuming the air, and mountains that rise like jagged spires over the sea. Yet beneath this beauty lies centuries of pain. Sicily has long been a crossroads of civilization, conquered by Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spaniards, and Bourbons. Each wave of rulers extracted what they could and left little for the Sicilians themselves. By the early 19th century, Sicily was part of the Bourbon kingdom of the Two Sicilies. In name, it was ruled from Naples, but in practice, it was abandoned to corruption, poverty, and despair. Large estates, known as latifundia, dominated the countryside. These estates were owned by wealthy nobles who rarely set foot on the island. Instead, they leased their lands to middlemen called gabelotti, who in turn employed armed guards, the campieri, to enforce their will. Life for the peasants who worked these lands was brutal. They were tenant farmers, scratching out survival while handing over the bulk of their crops in rent. Hunger was constant, education was non-existent, and the state offered little hope. When thieves stole cattle or bandits raided villages, there was no reliable police force to call upon. The Bourbon soldiers who roamed Sicily were often more feared than the criminals themselves. In this vacuum of power, the Mafia found its first breath. The rise of the Impieri. The Impieri were meant to serve as enforcers for the gabelotti. Their job was to guard harvests, intimidate peasants, and ensure that tribute flowed upward to the absentee landlords. But over time, these guards realized they could carve out power for themselves. Instead of merely protecting the land, they began to control it. They offered protection, not only from bandits but from themselves. Refuse to pay, and your vineyard might mysteriously burn. Complain to the authorities, and your livestock might vanish overnight. Accept their rule, and they would defend you from rival gangs, settle disputes, and guarantee order. To many Sicilians, this twisted system was preferable to the corrupt, indifferent state. The campieri provided something the government never had: a rough, brutal form of justice. In a land where authority was distant, these men became the only authority that mattered. Thus began the slow transformation of armed guards into an organized brotherhood. Cosa Nostra, our thing. By the mid-19th century, the brotherhood had a name: Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing. The words themselves carried weight. It was not just a phrase but a declaration that this society belonged to them and no one else. Not the landlords, not the Bourbon kings, not the church, and certainly not the police. Initiation rituals took on a sacred quality. A recruit would enter a darkened room lit by a single candle. He would prick his finger until blood flowed and drip it onto the image of a saint. The saint's picture would then be set aflame in his hands as he swore the oath. If he betrayed the brotherhood, his flesh would burn like the holy image. This oath was more than symbolic. It bound the initiate to a new family, one that demanded absolute loyalty above blood relations, above morality, above God himself. To betray the brotherhood was to invite death. At the heart of Cosa Nostra was omerta, the code of silence. To speak to authorities was dishonorable, a betrayal of manhood. Justice was settled internally, either through mediation or through violence. The word of a mafioso carried more weight than the decrees of the king. Cosa Nostra was not just an organization. It was a culture, a parallel society hidden within the fabric of Sicily. Blood and politics. As Italy moved toward unification in the 1860s, the Mafia adapted. The fall of the Bourbons and the arrival of the new Italian state did little to improve life for ordinary Sicilians. Corruption merely changed uniforms. New officials arrived from the mainland, eager to exploit Sicily but with little understanding of its people. The Mafia saw opportunity. They offered their services to politicians who needed votes, landlords who needed labor controlled, and businessmen who needed insurance. In exchange, they gained power and protection. Judges were bribed, police were infiltrated, and witnesses disappeared. By the late 19th century, the mafia was no longer a loose collection of enforcers. It had become a network that spanned the island, deeply entwined with both politics and business. Violence as currency. Violence was the mafia's most reliable tool. In Sicily, reputation was everything. A man's honor determined whether he was respected or trampled. For mafiosi, violence was not random but calculated. A murder was not just punishment, it was a message. A beating was not merely cruelty, it was advertisement. Fear became the currency of power. To control a village, it was enough for people to believe the mafia was watching, that disobedience would bring consequences. This climate of fear ensured compliance without the need for constant bloodshed. But when violence did erupt, it was spectacular. Whole families could be wiped out in retribution for a single betrayal. Bodies would appear in ditches, throats slit, or riddled with bullets, a reminder to everyone of the cost of defiance. The mafia and the people. To outsiders, it might seem that Sicilians despised the mafia. But the reality was more complicated. For many peasants, the mafia represented a cruel but effective form of authority. If your goat was stolen, the police might laugh in your face or demand a bribe. But if you appealed to the local mafioso, the thief would be found and punished. This created a paradoxical relationship. The mafia exploited the people, but it also protected them, at least against outsiders. To be under the wing of the mafia was both a burden and a shield. Over time, the mafia became woven into daily life. Weddings, funerals, business deals, all could involve mafiosi. Refusing them was not an option. They were everywhere and nowhere, both feared and respected, hated and admired. Early legends. By the late 1800s, names began to emerge. Men who became legends in Sicily. Figures like Antonino Giamona in Palermo or the Greco family in Sicily. These were not petty criminals but lords of the underworld, men who could command armies of loyalists and bend politicians to their will. The Grecos, in particular, would rise to prominence, establishing themselves as one of the most powerful mafia clans in history. Their story would intertwine with the later chapters of Cosa Nostra in America. The shadow of America. As Sicily sank deeper into poverty, waves of emigrants began leaving the island in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Millions sailed across the Atlantic, seeking new lives in the United States. Among them were men who carried the code of omerta in their bones, men who had grown up under the shadow of Cosa Nostra. In the crowded streets of New Orleans, Chicago, and above all New York, these men found both opportunity and chaos. They brought with them the traditions of Sicily, the oath, the silence, the ruthless pursuit of respect. But that is a story for another chapter. Closing of Chapter 1. Thus, the mafia was born not out of sudden invention, but out of Sicily's long history of exploitation and abandonment. It grew in the cracks left by a corrupt state, thrived in a culture that prized honor above life, and built itself on silence, loyalty, and fear. By the dawn of the 20th century, Cosa Nostra was no longer just Sicily's dark secret. It was an institution, one that would soon stretch its shadow across oceans and shape the destiny of entire nations. A new world, old shadows. When millions of Sicilians and southern Italians crossed the Atlantic at the turn of the 20th century, they carried with them not only their hopes for a better life but also the burdens of their homeland. Poverty, mistrust of government, and in some cases, the traditions of Cosa Nostra. New York became their new Sicily. The tenements of Little Italy on Mulberry Street, the markets of East Harlem, and the Brooklyn waterfront all pulsed with life, sweat, and survival. Immigrants packed into cramped apartments, speaking dialects the police could not understand, working brutal jobs for pennies a day. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To the mafia, it looked like opportunity. The seeds of power. At first, Italian immigrants were preyed upon. They were poor, unorganized, and mistrusted by mainstream American society. Criminal gangs, both Italian and otherwise, extorted them mercilessly. One of the earliest and most notorious rackets was the Black Hand, a crude form of extortion. Immigrants would receive letters marked with a black handprint, demanding money under threat of death. But from these crude beginnings, something more structured began to emerge. Men who had grown up under mafia culture in Sicily began organizing their neighborhoods in the New World. They offered protection from the Black Hand, mediated disputes, and demanded tribute just as their predecessors had in Sicily. Soon, Italian gangs began to dominate certain neighborhoods. Unlike their Irish or Jewish counterparts, they carried the weight of an ancient code, the omerta, that made infiltration by police nearly impossible. New Orleans, a bloody prelude. Before New York became the capital of the American Mafia, New Orleans had already seen its shadow. In 1890, the city witnessed the assassination of police chief David Hennessy, a crime blamed on Sicilian immigrants tied to the Mafia. What followed was one of the largest lynchings in American history. A mob stormed the jail and executed 11 Italians. Though brutal, the event revealed something important. Even in America, far from Sicily, the Mafia was present and feared. But it was New York, with its vast immigrant population and bustling ports, that would become the true empire of Cosa Nostra. The 5 Points and early gangs. In the early 1900s, New York was a city of gangs. The Irish ruled Hell's Kitchen, the Jews thrived on the Lower East Side, and Italians carved out territories in Little Italy and Brooklyn. Among the earliest Italian mobsters were men like Giuseppe Morello, nicknamed the Clutch Hand for his deformed right hand. Morello built one of the first true mafia families in America. From his base in Harlem, he ran counterfeiting operations, extorted businesses, and dealt in loan sharking. He imported olive oil and lemons, using them as fronts for smuggling. Morello's crew became known as the Morello crime family, and it would lay the foundation for what later became the Genovese family, one of the most powerful mafia clans in American history. But Morello's rise attracted rivals. The mafia, true to its nature, could not remain united. Factions formed, alliances shifted, and violence became inevitable. Prohibition. The golden opportunity. In 1920, America passed the Volstead Act, ushering in prohibition. The manufacture and sale of alcohol became illegal, and overnight, a vast black market was born. To the mafia, prohibition was not a law, it was a gift. Italian gangs, alongside Irish and Jewish counterparts, began smuggling liquor from Canada, the Caribbean, and beyond. Speakeasies popped up on every corner, serving bootleg whiskey and homemade gin. Trucks rumbled through the night, carrying barrels of beer disguised as milk. Police officers and politicians lined their pockets with bribes, turning a blind eye. For the mafia, alcohol became liquid gold. Fortunes were made, armies of enforcers were hired, and entire neighborhoods fell under their sway. No longer were the Italians seen as small-time extortionists. They were now businessmen of the underworld, providing what the public demanded. And with wealth came power. The Castellammarese War. But success bred conflict. By the late 1920s, two factions emerged in New York's Italian underworld. On one side stood Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, a powerful mobster who sought to dominate all Italian gangs in the city. On the other side was Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian newcomer from Castellammare del Golfo. The conflict that followed became known as the Castellammarese War, 1930 to 1931. It was a bloody, chaotic struggle that left bodies in the streets and fear in every neighborhood. Masuria relied on brute force and loyalty from older Neapolitan gangs. Maranzano, meanwhile, attracted Sicilian purists and rising young talents, including a cunning, ambitious gangster named Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano, born in Sicily but raised in New York, understood something neither Masuria nor Maranz. Anno fully grasped. The mafia in America could not survive if it clung only to old-world traditions. America demanded something new, an organization that was modern, structured, and business-oriented. Luciano's betrayal. As the war dragged on, Luciano made his move. Outwardly, he served Masuria. Secretly, he began talks with Maranzano. He realized that both bosses were relics, too blinded by pride to see the future. In 1931, Luciano lured Masuria to a Coney Island restaurant under the pretense of a card game. While Luciano excused himself to the bathroom, gunmen stormed in and riddled Masuria with bullets. His reign was over. But Luciano had little intention of being a loyal servant to Maranzano either. Just months later, fearing Maranzano's ambition and comparing him to Julius Caesar, Luciano struck again. He ordered a team of Jewish hitmen, disguised as government agents, to storm Maranzano's office. They stabbed and shot him to death. In 1 year, Luciano had eliminated both bosses and positioned himself as the most powerful gangster in New York. The Commission. Unlike his predecessors, Luciano had vision. He understood that constant bloodshed was bad for business. He reorganized the mafia in America into a corporate-like structure. At its heart were 5 families in New York: the Luciano, later Genovese; Mangano, later Gambino; Gagliano, later Lucchese; Prophesai, later Colombo, and Bonanno families. Each family had its own boss, underboss, and consigliere, with soldiers beneath them. Disputes between families were to be settled by a governing body known as the Commission, which Luciano created. This system reduced violence, stabilized territories, and allowed the mafia to expand into new rackets: gambling, unions, narcotics, and construction. It was the birth of the American Cosa Nostra as we know it today. Allies beyond blood. Luciano also broke with Sicilian tradition by forming alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters. He partnered with Meyer Lansky, a brilliant strategist, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a ruthless enforcer. Together, they built a national crime syndicate that extended beyond ethnicity. With these alliances, organized crime in America transformed from local gangs into a national network. Bootlegging empires stretched from Chicago to Miami, from Detroit to Los Angeles. The public enemy era. While the mafia thrived, America was captivated by its legends. Newspapers splashed names like Al Capone across headlines, painting them as both villains and folk heroes. Prohibition had created a new class of celebrity criminals, men who dined in fine restaurants, wore tailored suits, and laughed at the law. But behind the glamour lay brutality. Drive-by shootings, assassinations, and massacres were common. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, in which Capone's men gunned down 7 rivals in Chicago, shocked the nation. The mafia thrived on fear, but it also thrived on invisibility. While Capone attracted headlines, Luciano preferred shadows. He let others take the spotlight while he built something far more enduring: the fall of Prohibition. In 1933, Prohibition ended. For many gangs, this was a disaster. Their golden source of income had dried up. But for the mafia, it was merely a transition. They shifted into other businesses: narcotics trafficking, control of labor unions, gambling, and construction. The mafia had become so embedded in the fabric of America that it could not be undone by a single change in law. If anything, they emerged stronger, diversified, disciplined, and wealthier than ever. The shadow over America. By the mid-1930s, the mafia had secured its empire. Luciano, Lansky, and their allies ran the underworld like a board of directors. Judges were bribed, politicians were bought, and labor unions were infiltrated. The mafia touched everything from the docks of New York to the casinos of Havana. But their success came at a cost. The very structure that Luciano built made them visible to law enforcement. Federal agents began to realize that organized crime was not a collection of local gangs but a national syndicate. The war between the mafia and the state was only beginning. Closing of Chapter 2. The rise of the mafia in America was not inevitable. It was the result of poverty, opportunity, and ruthless ambition. From the crowded streets of Little Italy to the blood-stained floors of Prohibition speakeasies, the mafia carved out an empire with cunning and violence. Lucky Luciano's genius reshaped the underworld, turning it into a corporation of crime. And though America celebrated the end of Prohibition, it had only unleashed something far more dangerous: a mafia that was organized, wealthy, and here to stay. The shadows of Sicily had crossed the ocean, and now they belonged to America. After the empire. By the late 1930s, the mafia in America had reached a kind of uneasy equilibrium. The 5 families ruled New York, with Lucky Luciano's commission overseeing disputes across the country. Their reach stretched to Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and even Havana, where Meyer Lansky dreamed of turning Cuba into a gambler's paradise. But with great power came greater visibility. The press began to speak openly of a national crime syndicate, and law enforcement, once complacent, even corrupt, began to sharpen its teeth. Luciano himself was the first major casualty of this new scrutiny. In 1936, thanks to relentless prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, Luciano was convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Though he continued to exert influence behind bars, it marked the beginning of a slow unraveling of his personal empire, and the start of the government's war against Cosa Nostra. The war years. When World War II broke out, America needed every advantage it could find. The Navy feared Axis sabotage along the New York docks, and here, the Mafia's control over longshoremen became both a liability and an opportunity. The Office of Naval Intelligence struck a secret deal. They would cooperate with imprisoned mobsters, particularly Luciano, in exchange for protection of the waterfront and intelligence about Sicily. Luciano delivered. His contacts in Italy proved invaluable when the Allies invaded in 1943. As a reward, in 1946 Luciano's sentence was commuted on the condition he be deported to Italy. He left America aboard the SS Laura Keene, a king without a throne, watching the skyline of New York disappear into the mist. Though banished, Luciano never stopped scheming. From his exile in Naples and later Havana, he sought to control narcotics pipelines and rebuild influence. But the golden age he once commanded in New York was gone forever. Post-war prosperity and hidden shadows. The late 1940s and 1950s were years of prosperity for America. And for the Mafia. Soldiers returning home bought houses, families moved to the suburbs, and consumer culture blossomed. Beneath the shiny surface, however, the Mafia dug its roots deeper into unions, construction, and politics. The docks of New York remained firmly under mob control, with longshoremen's unions paying tribute. In Las Vegas, Bugsy Siegel's dream of building glamorous casinos took shape, though Siegel himself was murdered in 1947 for alleged mismanagement of Mafia funds. With the decline of prohibition profits, gambling became the new gold mine. Slot machines, bookmaking, and casinos funneled millions into Mafia coffers. Narcotics, though frowned upon by some old bosses, became increasingly lucrative. Heroin moved through Italian and Sicilian networks, enriching those willing to take the risk. It was during this period that names like Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and Joseph Bonanno rose to prominence, each carving out their dominion within the five families. The Appalachian Meeting. In November 1957, a rural town in upstate New York became the unlikely stage for one of the Mafia's greatest embarrassments. Over 100 mob leaders gathered at the home of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian to discuss business, succession, and territory. State troopers, suspicious of the sudden influx of luxury cars in the small town, raided the meeting. Dozens of mobsters fled into the woods and fields, their silk suits torn on barbed wire, their polished shoes caked in mud. Many were arrested. For years, the FBI, under the stubborn leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, had denied the existence of a national mafia. Appalachian made that denial impossible. Photographs of powerful men caught in flight shocked the nation. Congress demanded answers. And the FBI, embarrassed, was forced to admit what had been obvious all along. The Mafia was real, organized, and nationwide. The age of surveillance. From the late 1950s onward, the FBI intensified its war against organized crime. Wiretaps, undercover agents, and eventually the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, became deadly weapons against the Mafia. Still, for decades, the mob thrived. In the 1960s and 1970s, Mafia families controlled trucking, construction, garbage collection, and even pizza parlors, which became fronts for heroin trafficking. The so-called Pizza Connection case revealed an international network stretching from Sicily to New York, moving billions in narcotics. The Mafia was no longer just a neighborhood gang. It was a multinational enterprise. Gotti and the fall of the Gambinos. Perhaps no mobster embodied both the allure and downfall of the Mafia like John Gotti. Known as the Dapper Don for his flashy suits and charm, Gotti rose through the Gambino family by sheer ruthlessness. In 1985, he orchestrated the assassination of his own boss, Paul Castellano, outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. With Castellano gone, Gotti assumed control of the Gambino family, the most powerful of the five families. For a time, Gotti became a media sensation. Crowds cheered him outside courtrooms, tabloids splashed his grin across front pages, and juries repeatedly failed to convict him thanks to witness intimidation and bribery. He was hailed as the Teflon Don. Nothing stuck. But his hubris was his undoing. Gotti loved attention, breaking with the Mafia's code of discretion. The FBI wiretapped his headquarters, the Rave Night Social Club, capturing conversations that revealed his iron grip and ordering of murders. In 1992, Gotti was finally convicted of murder and racketeering. Sentenced to life without parole, he died in prison a decade later. His fall symbolized the fading myth of the untouchable mafia boss. The RICO Revolution. The most devastating weapon against the mafia was not bullets but law. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. It allowed prosecutors to charge not just individuals but entire organizations with ongoing criminal conspiracies. Suddenly, bosses who had insulated themselves behind layers of soldiers and lieutenants could be held responsible for the actions of their families. Wiretaps, informants, and flipped witnesses provided the evidence. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, RICO prosecutions gutted the mafia. Entire leadership structures were imprisoned. Once loyal capos turned government witnesses, most famously Sammy, the Bull Gravano, who testified against John Gotti. The code of silence, omerta, was broken. Fear no longer guaranteed loyalty. The Sicilian connection and global reach. Even as American families crumbled, the mafia in Sicily remained a powerful force. The Corleonesi faction, led by Salvatore Toto Riina, unleashed a reign of terror in the 1980s, murdering judges, politicians, and rival bosses. Their violence spilled across the Atlantic, fueling narcotics pipelines into the U.S. But the crackdown in Italy mirrored that in America. Brave prosecutors like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino led the Maxi trial of 1986 to 1992, convicting hundreds of mafiosi. Both men were assassinated in brutal bombings, but their sacrifice inspired relentless pursuit of the mafia. By the 1990s, Cosa Nostra, both in Sicily and America, was bloodied, fragmented, and weakened. Legacy in the shadows. Though diminished, the mafia never vanished. The five families still exist, operating in the shadows, stripped of their former glory but persistent as ever. They no longer control the city the way they once did, but they remain entrenched in certain unions, construction rackets, and low-key gambling. What remains strongest is the myth. From the Godfather films to Goodfellas and countless television shows, the mafia has become part of American folklore. The code of honor, the suits, the whispered meetings, all have been romanticized, obscuring the reality of fear, blood, and betrayal. The truth is more complex. The mafia was never about honor. It was about power. It thrived where poverty and mistrust of institutions created a vacuum. It succeeded because it understood both the weaknesses of men and the machinery of society. Epilogue. The enduring shadow. Today, the mafia is no longer the empire it once was. The FBI's war, combined with globalization, new forms of crime, and the rise of other ethnic gangs, has reduced its power. But like the tide, organized crime never disappears, it only changes form. The mafia still whispers through the streets of Brooklyn and Staten Island. Its legends live on in the stories told in bars, in the memories of old neighborhoods, in the films watched across the world. Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, John Gotti, these names remain etched in the mythology of America. They built empires of blood, only to see them crumble. And yet, in the silence of certain backrooms, in the coded language of men who prefer shadows, the legacy of Cosa Nostra lingers. For as long as there are men who crave power, there will be those willing to spill blood in its pursuit. The mafia may have declined, but the story of its rise, its reign, and its fall remains one of the most enduring in the history of America.